record as well?
Yeah,
And I will.
I'm recording. That's happening.
Excellent. So, good morning, afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Thank you for coming and participating in our webinar series on better governance and theories of regulation and governance. My name is David Levy-Faour, and I'm very happy to host Denny Kudrna here with us. I will present him in a minute. He will tell us about the New Zealand approach to better regulation. He call it regulatory stewardship, and he will present it himself. But let me first say that Denny is an economist at the School of Government at the Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. He taught in Vienna, in Salzburg, had various roles in the New Zealand Productivity Commission, in the New Zealand Treasury, the IMF, World Bank, European Commission, UN Development Program, and the Czech Ministry of Finance. So he's a globalist, right? One of those people who are traveling internationally, true global citizens of the world. His academic work was published in journals like Governance, the Journal of Common Market Studies, not yet in Regulation and Governance, but maybe later.
Hopefully.
Excellent. And he has authored a lot of policy brief to Aspen Institute, the Atlantic Council. He published in the Czech media, and he is a graduate of the Central European University at the time in Budapest, nowadays in Vienna. So Denny, thank you so much for coming, and the floor is yours, the screen is yours, and please go on.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and turning up for this lecture. Yeah, so today I would like to talk about regulatory stewardship, which is something that evolved as the New Zealand's answers to the challenges that lead to the better regulation agenda. So as many other countries, New Zealand faces the explosion of regulation. So the stock of legislation and regulation it's kind of exploded over the last 40 years from about 11 million words to 23 million words, even though the number of acts actually remains relatively stable, which probably says something about every individual act on average getting a lot more complex and simply longer. At the same time, the flow of regulation and legislation through the Parliament has kind of decreased from about 100 to 120 pieces of new acts or major amendments to about 80 in the last few years. However, the word count also increased, so there are fewer acts, but they are a lot longer and complex. So obviously, the relationship between the number of words in legislation and the regulatory outcomes we care about is complex. Some of these regulations, they create new markets and new opportunities. Some are probably what some people like to call red tape. However, regardless of the merit of the individual legislations or regulations, the overall size of the rulebook has the same effect as any other infrastructure. The more there is, the more it takes to maintain it, and that's the better regulation challenge, if you will. It's the question how to keep all these rules fit for purpose. The New Zealand answer is the regulatory stewardship. It's defined as the governance, monitoring, and care of regulatory systems to keep them fit for purpose and reduce regulatory failures. It is a close cousins to similar concepts and policy tools advocated by OECD, like the principles for reviewing the stock of regulations and the ex post reviews, or the EU Better Regulation Agenda, like the refit, evaluate first principles, and the fitness checks. So it shares number of features with this related approaches, but at the same time, it has some distinguishing features. One of them is that it doesn't look at individual acts or regulations. Instead, it looks at regulatory systems that are typically defined as a sort of bunch of acts, but also the policy agencies, i.e. the ministries, and the regulators, the enforcers of the rule. So it's a bit more comprehensive. It's not just the letter of the law, but it's also the organizations behind it. What it shares with the related approaches is this emphasis on moving from the set and forget approach to regulation to some kind of set and adapt, or keep fit for purpose approach to regulation, and that leads to this perception, at least on the level of the public service of the ministries and agencies, that regulation is not just a constraint, it's not just a red tape, it's an asset that needs to be maintained to work properly and to deliver on the expectations and to minimize some kind of unintended impacts or consequences. So that's the kind of idea behind regulatory stewardship, which has been around for over a decade. So it has been introduced to New Zealand legislation in 2013. Then there was some kind of research done by the Productivity Commission and looking at how this stewardship idea could work in practice. There were a number of recommendations introducing sort of training programs, like the Regulatory Practice Initiative that aims to improve the skills of regulators and regulatory policymakers. There was this tool called a Regulatory Systems Amendment Bill that I will talk a lot about, because it's one of the key pillar of relative success of the regulatory stewardship agenda, and it continues evolving. And the latest iteration in this regulatory stewardship story was the establishing of Ministry for Regulation about was it 15 months ago, when the new government came, and the new government is now pushing a regulatory standards bill, sort of imposing more ex ante obligation on the assessment of regulatory proposal, and regulatory stewardship is somehow add on to that, because obviously the focus on stewardship is more ex post. The concept of stewardship in general, and in some cases regulatory stewardship in particular, attracted some academic attention. So there are a couple of papers looking at the idea, and some of them, they highlight the risk of stewardship becoming this sort of magic concept, or rather an empty buzzword that allows the governments to pretend or talk about doing something in the regulatory space while not much is happening. Other authors, including Claudio, who is here today with us, were more open to recognize the innovative potential of regulatory stewardship, but pretty much all the authors agree that we simply need to know more about how stewardship is operationalized and what is the evidence of some kind of impacts on things that anybody cares about. So that is the agenda for this paper. What I did were two simple research questions. One, looking at the inputs. Are agencies making any effort to implement regulatory stewardship? And one is more focused on the outputs. So is regulatory stewardship producing something observable and measurable that could make a difference for the ultimate regulatory outcomes that we care about? So going to the first research questions, the first answer is yes, agencies are certainly talking about regulatory stewardship. So this shows number of hits on websites of the major New Zealand ministries. So in the middle, the MFR is the new Ministry for Regulation, which has started only recently. So there's not much on its website yet, but other ministries are actually talking about stewardship, are talking about regulation, and are talking about regulatory stewardship. But that doesn't really tell us that much about the activity behind it. So I tried to collect more systematic data. I looked at the regulatory system level, whether the lead agencies, i.e. the ministries responsible for the regulatory system, whether they describe the regulatory systems that it is responsible for, whether they devise some kind of strategy, how to implement and operationalize regulatory stewardship, whether they've done some assessments of their regulatory systems, and whether there is any evidence of institutionalized collaboration across the agency silos. Because many of the systems, they don't fit neatly into a single silo of a single ministry, and they require greater collaboration. I also looked at the sort of corporate documents. So the statement of intent, that's the kind of sort of document specific to the New Zealand Public Service that the leader of the ministry is kind of essentially setting up a work program to agree with the minister. So it's the statement of intent. When the government changes or when there is a new minister, the ministries, they produce so-called briefing for incoming minister, informing him about the agenda that they have to work on. There are obviously annual reports, so I can look whether there is some reporting on regulatory stewardship, and the responsible ministers responsible for the agencies that steward regulatory systems, they make public speeches. So I thought I would also look at whether they ever talk about it. So I went and Googled all these documents and all these websites and imposed very simple coding rules. If the desired aspect was mentioned, then I coded it as present. If not, I coded it as absent, and this is the result. So we can sort of see that all agencies made at least some effort in the first decade of regulatory stewardship development, and pretty much all the big regulatory agencies have described their system at some point in time. Most of them also introduce some kind of regulatory stewardship strategy and then some assessments. But also sort of closer look at the data would reveal that this commitment to stewardship was not really consistent in time. So agencies sometimes worked on it for 2 or 3 years, and then there was a gap of a few years, and then they would return to that. So it's kind of on and off in most places. Perhaps the only exception is the MB, which is the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, I believe, which is the single largest New Zealand ministry covering a lot of agenda. So they sort of had the capacity to invest in stewardship developments. And they're also the only ones that try to formalize the across the silo relationships, establish systematic collaboration between policy agencies, regulators, and everybody else involved in the regulatory system. They also developed or contributed to one of the most institutionalized collaborations called Council of Financial Regulators, where the Treasury, MB, Central Bank, and Financial Market Authority they collaborate on financial regulations, which is like the best example of institutionalization of stewardship. Looking at the other aspect, this is a bit more patchy. That is mentioned in most of the corporate documents, but the agencies, they never really go into specifics or never really make commitments, or never is too strong a word. Most of the time, they are sort of descriptive that, yeah, we are doing stewardship without committing themselves to any kind of specific outcomes. And I also found only one ministerial speech that was focused on regulators that would mention regulatory stewardship, which is probably a good indication that it's not really of interest for politicians. It's more the public service level initiative at this stage. So this very simple data set allows me to conclude that stewardship is certainly not dead. Not very robust conclusion, but we should bear in mind that many of these regulatory initiatives, they are often off to a good start, and there is a government commitment, and there are big ambitions, but that often fades away, and government becomes less interested, or there is a change of government, and the regulatory initiative is often over. So it's not a small achievement that stewardship has kind of survived 4 government constellations and keeps going. And it also outlasted similar initiatives in New Zealand, and I also believe in other countries that kind of faded into obscurity in 4, 5, 6 years, but certainly weren't being developed for over a decade. So I believe there is decent evidence that agencies are practicing regulatory stewardship despite all the caveats that I have mentioned. There is this ongoing estimate that New Zealand has about 200 regulatory systems. So when I count in them, there are descriptions for about 116. So about 60% of the estimated number of regulatory systems have been described, and for most of them, there is some kind of stewardship activity. So this is the story of the inputs based on the simple data collection. So now moving to the story of the outputs, whether stewardship has made any difference. When the Productivity Commission in 2014 made the inquiry into regulation and regulatory practices, they highlighted that to move from the set and forget approach to regulation, there needs to be some kind of legislative technology or tool that allows agencies to update the legislation in a more flexible way that deals with the constraints that the government on average does only about 80 amendments or new acts every year. So indeed, the big ministry, the MB that I have just mentioned, took initiative and developed this concept of regulatory system amendment bills. So there are a lot of comparative parameters comparing it to the Statutes Amendment Bill, which is a traditional established tool to fix technical, short, and non-controversial issues in regulation, and the standalone act that can amend any parameter of the regulatory system. So the regulatory systems amendment bills, or so-called RSABs, they kind of fit in the middle. They can change more than just technicalities, but they cannot change the fundamental design principles of the regulatory systems. What is quite important detail is that there are omnibus bills, and I will talk about it a bit later, but the omnibus bill is the legal structure that allows to introduce a lot of small changes to many different acts and many different systems at the same time. And the RSAP is also approved during the parliamentary process by the near unanimity rules, near unanimity of parties, which is a more flexible rule than the unanimity that applies for the technical changes for the statute amendment bills, but it's also more demanding than the majority of MPs that the standalone acts and amendments So yeah, it's kind of a in the middle compromise. So before I go more into these arrangements, let's first have a look on the outcomes. You know, what it actually produced, what the fact that agencies could develop regulatory system amendment bills did to the process of adapting legislation and regulation, or rather regulatory system. So compared to the counterfactual scenario, which would basically be only doing the statute amendment bills, those small uncontroversial technicalities, the introduction of RSABs enabled more changes to more acts or regulatory systems by more agencies in less time. So they more than doubled the number of changes, and as a sort of unit of change in this is a legal paragraph or legal section, because the way these RSABs, these bills are drafted, is that every change is in one paragraph. And some changes are quite minor. There's probably an example when it changes some kind of typo or grammar. Most of the changes are more substantive, but some of them are getting quite significant, and it's really difficult when a tool changes dozens or more laws to kind of establish whether any change is significant or more or less a technicality. So here I rely on the New Zealand rules around regulatory impact assessment, that any regulatory change in New Zealand is subject to the regulatory impact statement, which is the sort of standard RIA, unless it is exempted on no or minor impact grounds. So I simply matched the paragraphs in the legislation in the RSAB with the RIA statements to see what proportion of these changes required the RIA and therefore has been judged as more significant than minor by the agencies, and therefore they developed the RIA. And it is a small slice in the first 6 years, but clearly the trend is towards using the RSABs for more significant changes. So it's a tool that has become more ambitious. It probably has potential for more significant upgrading of regulatory systems if this trend continues. Since I was playing with the data, I also looked at the question whether the RSAB can deliver on the sort of burden reduction agenda that the current New Zealand government is pushing for. So I used the fact that most of these paragraphs, they have kind of standard legal structure. So there is some kind of operational word instructing the lawyers what is the basic intent behind the paragraph, whether it's to amend the laws or insert additional text in the existing legislation or to repeal. And obviously, the repeal is probably a decent proxy for the amount of burden reduction. It's not a perfect, it's an estimate, and it's quantitative text analysis. So there are no precise details, but what it tells us is that again the trend is towards including more of these repeal paragraphs that may translate into burden reduction, which is the policy priority of the current government. So the point really is that this proves that the RSABs are flexible, that if you have the center-right government with the burden reduction agenda, it can deliver on that, or it can focus more on the general sort of improving the quality of regulation. Now, as David had said at the beginning, I'm an economist, and looking at this, it looked like a bit of a free lunch. You can adapt your regulatory systems to changing circumstances, great, but isn't there some kind of trade-off? And so I dig deeper in the parliamentary procedures, and it kind of became obvious that before the introduction of the RSABs, there were sort of two stable equilibria. On the one hand, the technicalities were legislative changes with low significance, and they received relatively low level of scrutiny. On the other hand, there were the standalone acts and amendments that introduce significant legislative changes, and they were subjected to high levels of scrutiny, but they could not be introduced as omnibus bills because in general, parliaments have bad experience with using omnibus structures because it often leads to the government kind of mixing things that have parliamentary support with things that with proposals that would not receive parliamentary support on their own. It can also lead towards sort of hiding the proposals that may sound insignificant, but in practice they have big impact on the regulatory system or whatever else the legislation is dealing with. So for these highly significant changes, most parliaments insist on using the single subject proposals that are more transparent and enable the scrutiny. So the RSAB, the Regulatory Systems Amendment Bills, it kind of introduced this in the middle category. And the question is that if the medium significance legislative changes are only scrutinized on this low level, then it's probably not sustainable. Because many parliaments, including the New Zealand ones, they kind of stopped using the omnibus legislation if the government started to misuse it to bundle a lot of unrelated proposals into a single piece of legislation. So the question is that maybe the RSABs that can deliver all these changes, they are basically based on a temporary loophole that the parliament will discover that they are pushed too far and will stop supporting the more significant changes in the omnibus bill structure. So I looked at the procedure that the parliament is using to approve. So it's as any other legislation, any other act in New Zealand, it goes through the standard parliamentary procedure. The bill is introduced first reading, Select Committee, second reading, House Committee, third reading, and the royal assent, which is the Governor General signing the law on behalf of the King Charles III. So that's the formal moment when it becomes a binding legislation. So RSABs are no different in most of this procedure, except this one thing in the business committee. That's a really crucial test because the business committee has a total discretion on whether to accept the omnibus bill proposal or not. And of course, if they don't accept it, then all this efficiency, all this ability to introduce more changes to more laws, to more systems in relatively short time, it disappears. So it's kind of the crucial sort of litmus test for this process, and agencies know that, and they also face some kind of you could call it tragedy of commons situation because they know that they like the fact that they can adapt their regulatory systems every 2 or 3 years when they prepare the RSABs. It's valuable to them because they are responsible for stewardship. It's part of their legal obligations. It's part of the Public Service Act that the ministries need to steward their legislation and their regulatory systems. So they like it, and obviously there is a risk that if one of the agencies overstretches the Parliament's acceptance of the omnibus bill proposals, they all lose access to this innovative legislative technology. So what is quite unique to RSABs is the procedure that where agencies informally, there's this cross-agency working group where they try to coordinate and they share the know-how how to develop the RSABs and how to make sure that they don't trigger some kind of political conflict that would probably stop them and prevent them from being accepted, because there is this crucial hurdle that the business committee needs to agree by near unanimity, which basically means that it's unanimity without one of the small parties getting the veto power over the decisions. So the two big parties in the parliament and two or three small parties need to agree, and there can be only one or two small parties disagreeing. Otherwise, it wouldn't go through. So what is quite unique is this effort that the ministries make in preparing the proposals in order to make sure that the business committee accepts them and that they can process, and then that they can deliver all the changes that I have just documented. Which gets me to the overall conclusions. So my interpretation of the regulatory stewardship experience is that New Zealand has developed some kind of low-cost approach to the ex post assessment of regulations, or the reviews of stock of regulation. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that OECD imagines in their best practices for management of stock of regulation. So the consultation process is sort of a mixture of largely informal talking to stakeholders. Even the more significant changes that require the regulatory impact analysis, they would probably go through targeted consultations, where the ministry picks the stakeholders to talk to rather than the fully structured and transparent process that OECD imagines. So it sort of cuts the corners to some extent, but unlike the proper ex post reviews, it does happen. New Zealand and many other countries, they do have the theoretical ability to conduct ex post reviews, but it hardly ever happens in practice, because they take resources, and few countries have public service that is so resourced that it can work outside of government priorities, doing the ex post reviews or the reviews of stocks of regulation. So the stewardship, the elegance of it is that it can deliver at relatively low cost something that is typically hard to deliver. I mean, teach our students about the policy cycles, define the problem, define the alternatives, pick one, implement it, and then monitoring and evaluation. And we all know that this category is often empty, and regulatory stewardship can actually provide some observable content that I try to describe in this presentation. I was sort of asking myself, why is that? I think big part of it is that before the RSABs were introduced, even if the public servants at ministries and the regulatory agencies, even if they knew that there are non-controversial, consensual improvements to the regulatory systems that could be easily implemented, they had to wait for years, sometimes maybe even decade, until the parliament gets to the point where it can amend or replace the underlying law, the act that defines the regulatory systems. Whereas now, if they have this knowledge, every 2 or 3 years, they will get an opportunity to include it in an RSAB. So this knowledge now has a productive outlet. It was kind of ignored before, and the fact that I think 9 RSABs have gone through the parliament, and there are another 4 or 5 in the pipeline, sort of shows that it is possible to find the set of regulatory improvements that doesn't trigger political controversies that would probably be too costly for the parliament to process, and that would probably stop the RSAS. So some of the reasons why the regulatory stewardship and the RSABs work are sort of related to, are sort of specific to New Zealand environment. It is a small country, so the high levels of informality are generally accepted. There's probably higher level of sort of institutional trust, or maybe I should say a lower level of political polarizations, because I can imagine that even relatively mundane regulatory proposals in some highly polarized countries would trigger some kind of infighting, whereas in New Zealand, the RSABs typically received bipartisan support, or and often adopted unanimously. So obviously, the RSAB design builds on the strength of the New Zealand system, but in principle, I think it is something that could be replicable, or that other countries could emulate. The regulatory system amendment bills that enable the change at scale and speed, they are the real innovation. They were the real surprise that enables this what magic and way concept of regulatory stewardship that enable it to deliver something observable, measurable, some clear output. They depend on these fine-tuned checks and balances, but it's, they are around for 9 years now, and they are still being accepted by the parliament. So they are probably coming closer to becoming a standard practice rather than some kind of discretionary exemption of the business committee, whether they accept the omnibus bill proposal or not. And then there are some long-term implications of having stewardship and having RSABs in New Zealand that we are yet to discover. And I'm getting to more speculative territory here, but I think it's quite interesting that the fact that RSABs provide a credible ex post option for improvement of legislation and regulation, it sort of takes off the burden of the ex ante regulatory impact analysis. Because in New Zealand, there is currently a debate to actually strengthen the RIA and add more and more criteria to figure out whether regulatory proposals and legislative proposals meet the highest standards. But at the same time, all the legislation is more complex. The world is probably a lot more uncertain than it used to be. So the RIA is becoming harder to do well. Even if there is capacity, even if there is skills and resourcing, it is harder to do. So knowing that if we cannot get it right first time, and if RIA cannot really resolve or ensure high quality legislation or legislation that fits for purpose, there is the later option. 2 or 3 years down the road, we have this tool that enables us to change things quickly and with relative ease, when we know what we as the regulators, as the public servants, when we know what can be changed without triggering some kind of political infighting or relitigation of all the controversial aspects of the regulatory system. So that's why I thought, some of you might be interested in this story. I think there is quite some comparative potential. So I will be very keen to get your feedback and questions, and perhaps some suggestions whether there are some similar systems that we could compare stewardship to and learn from it. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Denny. Excellent presentation. I can imagine how good, even better it was if it was 10 in the morning rather than 10 in the night in Wellington, but it was excellent. So thank you so much. I have many questions, but the priority is first of all to the guests. So who wants to come in? There is Melanie is asking on the chat. Maybe you want to ask, open your mic. Please.
Yeah, that's fine. Happy to. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. Maybe just to give some background as to where my question is coming from. I'm based in the Netherlands and did a review of all the kind of policy plans of the regulatory agencies in the Netherlands recently. It struck me that the terminology that we tend to use for similar practices is quite varied, and I wondered whether your analysis has been impacted by a kind of lens of regulatory stewardship, because I can see in the Netherlands that here the regulatory agencies are using different terms to perhaps talk about similar practices. Responsive regulation, risk-based inspection, citizen involvement, principle-based regulation. Those would be some of the terminology that's more familiar here, but would point really to kind of similar practices as you are talking about. So I wonder kind of what the terminology is that's being used to talk about this in your context, and how that might have impacted your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, stewardship is quite unusual term, and it probably is one of those terms that some researchers label magic concepts, like governance or accountability, and that people generally like and think it's a good thing. But that are difficult to nail down. What are they really about? And that's why I thought that trying to go at it from the empirical angle, try to collect some data, however imperfect, and see whether stewardship actually has content, has something that is observable. Might be the best way to approach it. And I think that the data that I've presented document that something is going on. It's not just completely just a smoke screen or a buzzword without content. I actually don't know how they in New Zealand how they arrived at this term. Yeah, because you could call it governing, managing, maintaining. What this mixture of terms may mean that we are at this stage of competing innovations. I mean, many countries are trying to figure out something to keep updating, shift from this set and forget to the set and adapt. And we are sort of experimenting with different concepts that probably have very overlapping meaning. Yeah, I'm not sure how we may end up calling it in the end, but I'm pretty sure that the problem that I started with, that I framed the analysis with the policy accumulation, having more and more legislation and needing better tools to manage it. That's a real problem in pretty much every advanced country.
Thank
So
you,
we'll
Denny.
probably keep experimenting.
Thank you so much, Denny and Melanie. I know you want to continue, but we have more questions. We will collect a few questions. First from New Delhi, please. And let me also say, Sir George Mason and Cordova, Cesar Cordova, you are welcome to speak directly. If not, I will read your comments. But in New Delhi first.
Yes. Hi. Thanks very much for the talk. It was extremely enlightening. We work in a think tank in New Delhi, and we advise the government of India on regulatory design and lawmaking. My question to you would be, you see, in India, our experience has showed us that the bulk of regulatory systems, the law on regulatory systems, is contained not in primary legislation, but in subordinate legislation. So this would mean rules issued by government departments or regulations made directly by the regulators themselves. And as a result, ex post improvements to regulatory systems also happens through subordinate legislation. And parliamentary oversight over this subordinate legislation is scant at best in India. So in a jurisdiction like ours, how do you think regulatory stewardship could be implemented?
Thank you so much, Denny. Please write it. We'll take Cesar Cordova from Regulatory Reform Team in Washington. Cesar, please open your mic. You are muted.
Actually, I'm in Paris. But anyway, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm going to be short. And coming back to your last point about ex ante and ex post, has the experience with this tool, the RSBAs, had an influence, a lessons, an impact on the RIS, on the disciplines, including the substance, including the institutional oversight, etc. What has been this relationship between ex ante, ex post? Has some lessons been learned? Has been impacts been outcomes achieved? Thank you.
Do you want me to go, David? You are muted now.
Maybe after George Mason.
Okay.
George, can you introduce yourself, please? You are muted. Well, please.
Kia ora, Tato. I'm George Mason. I'm a Director of Regulatory Environment in the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment in New Zealand. I'm also enrolled at ANU doing a doctorate in regulation and governance. I didn't really have a question. I just was just adding a little bit further to the points that Denny had made about the peculiar nature, I suppose, of stewardship is this kind of long-term systematic approach to caretaking regulatory systems. So beyond just how you might try to orient the operation of them day to day, even month to month, year to year, but actually the idea of treating them as infrastructure, as things to be looked after and tended, including capability within the systems is I guess, a key aspect of stewardship endeavour, and possibly marks it out a little differently from the terms we were talking about previously. There's sort of these multi-dimensions to it, capability building for the people operating the regulatory systems, the idea that you would systematically update the legislative book as you can, the kind of connection between ex ante and ex post, this idea that you're probably going to get regulation wrong in a more complex environment, and your ability to pivot and try to fix it up quickly as you learn the lessons of its operation is maybe a more effective way to get more effective regulation than spend a lot of time at the start putting it through a lot of process to get it right. But those are just some general comments.
Thank you, George. And Denny, now you can go on, please.
Okay, so the question from India about the secondary legislation that can also improve the systems. Well, I have to admit that I'm sort of guilty looking for the keys under the lamp, or whichever way the saying goes, because the primary legislation is observable at this stage. There is a lot of regulatory stewardship activity that is observable only for the insiders, like George, that from a researcher from outside doesn't really have the sort of document track record to analyze. So stewardship is not only about the RSABs, the collaboration that I was talking about, the cross-silo ability to make operational improvements, to change the secondary legislation or tertiary legislation, all these guidelines and recommendations. That is, at least I haven't found a way to kind of observe it and present it. So I know from anecdotal evidence that this is happening. There is a mixed bag of successes and not so much. But at this stage, I'm not aware of any systematic evidence that would show how it works on the level of secondary legislation. I may have a similarly disappointing answer to the question from Paris. But the regulatory stewardship is relatively new. The RSABs, they started in 2016. Then there was the disruptions because of the COVID. So I think we are getting to the stage where we will start to observe whether there is a relationship between the ex ante RIA and the ex post stewardship. The fact that the current government had created the Ministry for Regulation, that among other things, it will also look at stewardship. They are planning to collect data, and there is also a reform of the RIA process in the works. So that will soon enough, probably this year, it will provide some evidence to analyze whether there is a relationship between the ex post and ex ante, but it's simply a bit too early to say at this stage.
Thank you so much, Denny. And Claudio, please.
Okay, thank you for this presentation that has so many angles, really, really rich. I'll take one, which is words, right? Labels, words are important. And what I like about regulatory stewardship, it just doesn't say whether regulation is too much or necessarily bad. It says, look, regulation is an asset, and therefore we have to make this asset productive, which is similar a little bit to what Mayone said in the past about regulators being trustees, right? So you have something that has public value in your hands, and you have to make sure that it's valuable. Now, there are three questions, however. One is that we don't know what the metrics is or are in order to measure the value of the asset. One could think of life saved, cost-benefit analysis, so that we will go back into a benefit cost consideration. But there is this element of ambiguity, I think, if there's an asset and I don't want to measure that in monetary terms, well, what else is left? Is a parliamentary judgment, political judgment, the parties in office, etc. The second, as Cesar touched upon, is that this is an efficient way to look at ex post. However, then day by day, we introduce legislation that is assessed with a RIA system. RIA looks at legislation on a one-by-one format. So the RIA maybe a little bit of the tree, whereas the system you described is the forest, and the two have some contradictions, and I wonder whether there is a way to link them. And the third is that with the omnibus bills, especially in Europe, they are a bit dodgy from the point of view of law. I understand that the need of the omnibus is to create adaptive and fit for purpose legislation. However, the risk in heavy legal systems like France, Belgium, Italy, it would be that they would be probably taken to court. So what are the costs of adversarial legalism with this approach that works with bits and pieces into the omnibus bills? Thanks.
Thank you, Claudio. And Denny, please respond.
Yeah, I think the three questions they have sort of a imperfect but common answer, because when I'm trying to think where the value comes from, why is the RSAB and stewardship sort of technology, why is it valuable? I think a lot comes from this distinction between politically contested and sort of uncontested, or you may call it technical even, but still substantive changes, still substantive updates. Because the fact that civil servants can make this distinction and avoid the relitigation of the contested aspect of the regulatory system, at every occasion, it's important. It's part of the reasons why it's relatively successful. So yes, we know that we have no numeraire for regulation. We have no unit of analysis to value and compare it, but we can at least make the distinction between the political that should be avoided and the technical. The fact that the set of the relatively technical improvements is not empty. That's where the value comes from, because we can keep updating the systems without relitigating the politically contested aspects. And if we do it well, we probably also manage the risk of adversarial legalism, as you called it, that could come with the omnibus bill. Yeah. Then the last question about essentially the interaction or the discrepancy, perhaps, that RIA is focused on the single legal instrument, whereas stewardship is focused on regulatory system. Yeah, that is another thing to see how it will work now that the new ministry hopefully will make the processes around regulatory stewardship more transparent and more linked. I know, again, there's some anecdotal evidence that the people at the ministries, they can connect those two things. So when they do RIA, it's often, at least the better examples of RIA. They are not. Some of them are not worth the PDF, as it's probably the case in most countries. But in the good examples of RIAs, they are informed by the experience from regulatory stewardship. So there is a feedback loop, but it's not kind of systematic. It's not institutionalized. It's probably quite haphazard at this stage, and depending on whether the right person who has the knowledge is involved in the RIA process.
Thank you so much, Denny. We have more questions, but I have to finish here because I have other commitments. I suggest to my colleagues in New Delhi, to send me the email, and I will forward to Denny. I invite you all to take part in this series. Now, with what happens in the United States and the new commission coming into force in operation in the EU, I think the issue that were raised here are going to be very, very important. We will have opportunity to hear Denny and Claudio and other experts in the future. And please send your ideas, comments to me or to the other participants. So thank you so much, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you, Denny, and good night.
Thank you for coming. Good night. Well, morning.
Bye.